Hello, I'm Robin Spinks from Royal National Institute of Blind People, RNIB. It's really good to be joining you all today, and I hope you find this an interesting and useful session. I want to talk a little bit about some strategies for embedding inclusive design into organisations. At RNIB, we've had quite a long history of working with organisations of all shapes and sizes. I've spent around about 10 years working with organisations to try and bring about, if you like, a more inclusive culture. And I'd like to talk about some of the things that make that a possibility, some of the things that have been particularly helpful, and also perhaps some things to be aware of that are perhaps less obvious. So I'll start off by saying that my strategy and my work in this area is informed by my background, which is that I'm an educational guidance advisor and counsellor, but I also have low vision. I grew up with a condition called albinism, which means that I have severely restricted vision to the point that I am registered as severely sight impaired or registered blind. And that means that, you know, the vision I have is probably 10% of what someone with fully corrected vision would have. But importantly, I have no sense of loss or deficit because the vision that I have is entirely normal to me. And I've grown up, gone to school, college, university, travelled around the world and worked in more than 30 countries independently. And I've done that as a low vision person. So I bring that personal experience to my work in enabling organisations to create changes. So I work as a senior manager in innovation at RNIB. I'm also the Vice Chair of Technology for the World Blind Union. That's the global body that reports to the United Nations on issues of blindness and visual impairment. So next slide, please. Globally, there are at least 2.2 billion people who have a visual impairment or blindness, of whom at least 1 billion have a vision impairment that could have been prevented or has yet to be addressed. And that's really important. That's a significant change in the way that WHO categorized figures as of late last year. Previously, they recorded a total number that was in the hundreds, 285 million. And you might be wondering what's happened that's made that figure so much higher. Well, really, they're now including people who have uncorrected refractive error. So there are many millions of people in developing countries, for example, who have significantly impaired vision. And the reason for their impairment is that they don't have correction in the form of refractive error or glasses, if you like, to correct their vision. So that's why that number is perhaps bigger than you might expect it to be. WHO changed the way that they counted those figures. If we bring that to a UK level, there are about 2 million people in the UK who have a permanent and uncorrected and uncorrectable visual impairment, and that has an impact on their day-to-day lives to varying extents. It's worth being aware that more than 90% of people who are visually impaired will have some form of vision, so they might be able to see shapes or colours, but they might not be able to see enough detail to recognise a friend at a distance of a metre, or to be able to move around independently, perhaps in a dark environment. So you can think for a moment just how complex that picture is. It's a very broad and diverse community of people. And that has its challenges in terms of enabling people to understand how visual impairment impacts on people's lives. The leading causes of vision impairment are uncorrected refractive error and cataracts. And in the Western world in particular, cataracts and age-related macular degeneration are the most popular visual impairments, most common visual impairments. And many people will simply report that they can't see as well as they used to be able to see when they were younger. And often other people will notice the reduction in function before the individual will, because the loss is so gradual and progressive. And you can imagine if your vision deteriorated over a period of years, it might actually be difficult for you to notice that impairment because it was so gradual. That's important for us to think about in terms of inclusive design. because often the individual with the condition or impairment may actually be less aware of the impact that condition has had on them, and they've adjusted as they've gone along. So most persons with vision impairment are over the age of 50. It's a disability that will tend to onset in later life. Next slide, please. So RNIB is over 152 years old now, and we're often referred to in the tech space as the Victorian charity in Silicon Valley. And that might be a surprising term for you to hear. We are about embracing technological change and partnering with companies and innovators to enable greater inclusion for blind and partially sighted people and others with disabilities, I might add. So wherever you go in the world, the legislation around disability is, of course, quite rightly pan-disability, and that's the legislation that we work with, and all of the companies who would develop a consultancy relationship with us, that would be the basis, would be pan-disability. However, we're recognising that our specialism is in sight loss, and that's a condition and a disability where there are lots of challenges, as we'll discover in a moment or two. So it's one of the harder disabilities for organisations to tackle, if you like. Many companies tell us that they can quite easily think about level access to buildings, and perhaps wheelchair accessibility is quite a tangible thing for people to think about. But when you move to imagining the kind of accommodations that might make things better for someone with a visual impairment, it's a more challenging endeavour. So our goal is to create positive change and to achieve change through collaboration and facilitating the development of attractive, accessible products, services, and culture. And I think it's really important to think about that bundle of products, services, and culture, because those things are increasingly becoming, interconnected. We're seldom now thinking about hardware in isolation. We're thinking about hardware as being a combo of hardware, software, and services. The customer experience is often a dynamic blend of those three things. And I think when we think about inclusion, we need to be thinking about that. You could make a piece of hardware totally accessible, but that's completely pointless if the software running on it has major accessibility challenges and the services that people subscribe to also involve additional barriers. So we need to think about that in a really holistic way. Next slide, please. Some of the clients that we either are currently working with or have worked with in the last couple of years, Bank of England, we worked with the Bank of England to ensure that the banknotes, the new banknotes, have accessible markings on them. And if you have any banknotes on your person and you feel to the corners of the banknotes, you'll become aware of tactile marks that are in place to basically enable blind people to determine the difference between a £10 note and a £20 note, for example. That was a complex exercise working with the Bank of England. It's very much about polymer technology and chemistry and security. And it was a really good example of where accessibility and inclusive design have to sit really closely alongside a very understandable security and counterfeit concerns. And those were really the challenges that were driving that particular engagement, was to ensure that the banknotes are safe and secure, but also that there are accessibility features to help people with disabilities. Samsung, we've worked with for a number of years now, initially reimagining their TV platform. If you have a Samsung Smart TV at home that is perhaps 2017 or newer, you will see the fruits of RNIB's labours in the accessibility settings on your device. If you care to have a look, there is a screen reader across the operating system, the Tizen operating system, and there are various other accessibility features that have been basically baked into the operating system to make it a good experience for people with disabilities. And that continues, there's not an end point in this journey. We're constantly responding to customer feedback, constantly trying to make things better, and super excited and keen to have as much customer feedback as possible. because that's ultimately what makes things better. Storm Interface, they're a UK company. We worked with them to design an accessible check-in kiosk. You won't find, surprisingly, you won't find any of those in the UK just yet. And that's because the legislation here doesn't mandate them currently. But you will find those check-in kiosks appearing in airports across the United States, for example. We've been working with Amazon for a number of years now. So most notably, a few years back, we did an exercise to try and find the best text-to-speech in the world. We found it in Poland in the form of a small startup called Ivona. And rather bizarrely, straight after we'd made that connection, we had an approach from Amazon saying, can you help us to find the best text-to-speech in the world? We introduced Amazon to Ivona, and a few months later, we got an email from the guys at Ivona, surprise, surprise, telling us we've been acquired by Amazon. Fantastic. Shortly afterwards, Amazon invited us into a darkened room in Washington, DC, to look at a new service which would be forthcoming and which they believed would have an impact for blind and partially sighted people. We'd no idea what that was, whether it was a product or a service, whether it was hardware or software. We simply went into a completely darkened room and had some conversations under NDA. Lo and behold, what tumbled out of that about a year later was the very first Amazon Echo device in 2016 in the UK. And of course, since then, we've seen this huge explosion of devices that you speak to, either running on Amazon's platform or also on the Google platform in the form of Google Home. It's become incredibly popular. And we're very much seeing that as part of the landscape for blind and partially sighted people in terms of procuring products and services. It's super important, and also reducing loneliness, which is a key concern. We've worked with Gatwick Airport on many considerations around travel and accessibility. Also Heathrow Airport, so a number of airports across the world we've had an engagement with around how do we make the passenger experience better? How do we tackle the complex web of barriers that exist for disabled people in airports? It's a very much a multifaceted project when you're working with an airport, because you've got so many different systems and interfaces, processes, passenger protocols, and a great range of service providers as well. So it's a complex environment, but one where we believe we can make a big difference in terms of removing barriers and making the experience more seamless. A lot of work with Lego recently, which is super exciting, to make Lego more accessible for blind and partially sighted children, make that more inclusive. Work with Sky on a whole range of fronts, from apps and devices through to services. We work with a number of banks. I've mentioned here Royal Bank of Scotland, but there are many that we work with, Lloyds also, NatWest. Some of those engagements have been around cards, bank cards, dealing with some of the disruptors that are coming into the banking industry. So for example, the emergence of flat cards that don't have tactile numbers on them anymore. Things like PIN on glass, which is appearing quite rapidly. How do you make that accessible? Microsoft, we have a long history of working with Microsoft. I'm very lucky to be represented on their World Blind Union Accessibility Strategy Board, where we're working with the leadership at Microsoft to determine what does the future roadmap look like. How can the needs of the blind and partially sighted community be best assimilated by the folks at Microsoft? And we've seen some really exciting things coming along there, not least the adaptive Xbox controller that has appeared as a mainstream product last year. And it's just giving accessibility a much broader and more central focus across the piece. And that's a really exciting relationship. Mila, we're working with Mila right now on a washing machine which will be accessible, which is accessible for blind and partially sighted people. You can imagine, can't you, that when you go to purchase a new domestic appliance as a blind or visually impaired person, you are greeted with a touchscreen interface pretty much everywhere now. And that allows a lot more flexibility for manufacturers and designers and developers. But for individuals with vision loss, it's extremely challenging, because I'm sure you can imagine that if you don't have a screen reader baked into a device, how do you know what it says on the screen? If you turn on the accessibility features on your iPhone or your Android phone, you can swipe left and right, you can double tap, triple tap, you can perform rotor gestures, and you can interact with the device using software that's baked into your iPhone or your Android device. But that's not the case in the domestic appliance arena, and we're really happy to be working with Mila on a way forward with that, and really tackling that whole range of barriers that people face in the kind of kitchen and domestic appliance space. It's absolutely filled with opportunity when you think about it in relation to making devices accessible, but also harnessing the power of Google Home and Amazon Echo and other smart speakers. So thinking about Samsung and Bixby and thinking about Microsoft and Cortana, we really work with any provider who is committed to the same mission as us. So we don't work with certain brands. It's about who would like to engage on this, who's showing willingness to actually break down barriers and create more inclusive products, because we've discovered that's the way to create a more inclusive culture. Capital One, again, a great relationship involved with all aspects of their operation. Next slide, please. So achieving a positive culture of inclusion is really about encouraging openness at every level in the organization. It's about reflecting on what works well and making it stronger and more meaningful. So was a particular version of an interface or software platform, was that particularly good from an accessibility standpoint? How can we learn from it? How can we make something that's even better and goes even further in creating a better user experience for all users? Reflecting diversity in all that we do. I've mentioned an Alexa example there. We worked with the Amazon team to think about how do we send out a really powerful message about accessibility without specifically mentioning it. Around about 25 million people saw the advert last year for Alexa, and that actually involved a lady who was blind at the end of the advert. And really the story there was, this is a super powerful tool, everyone benefits from using it, and at the end of the commercial, you know, it's kind of like just a bit of a coincidence this person happens to be blind. First and foremost, they're an Alexa user and they're getting everything from the technology that all of us do. But, you know, that technology is open and usable for them. Ask, this is a great mantra, attitude, skills, and knowledge. Think about that in relation to that positive culture. Those are the most important components. Encouraging participation and engagement throughout our organization, and creating channels for community feedback at every level of our community and user base. And also thinking about lifelong learning as a kind of cultural reflection tool. Next slide, please. So embedding those inclusive ways, how do we think about information creation, storage, retrieval, and dissemination? We need to do that across our organization. How do we reward people for thinking in an inclusive way? Let's make it competitive and fun. Let's gamify it in the positive way where people recognize that inclusion is a great way to be, and inclusive behaviors are the right behaviors. How do we know how well we're doing? Well, we need to talk to people. We need to constantly assess. We need to take a temperature check throughout various meetings and fora. What does success look like? Where do we want to be from an inclusion and accessibility viewpoint? Because unless we can answer that, it's difficult to determine how well we're doing. How can we foster empathy and understanding in our teams? Absolutely critical in terms of moving this forward. Next slide, please. Some of the waves of opportunity in tech that will make a huge difference going forward. So we're seeing artificial intelligence and computer vision are already changing the landscape for our community. Applications like Be My Eyes, for example, and Seeing AI from Microsoft. Wonderful applications that are opening things up using AI. 5G will also radically change the way that we think about connectivity. I would argue as an early adopter that, you know, we're nowhere near success with 5G. We've got a long way to go, but that will gradually start to change the way that people experience all sorts of services. I'd also think about the Internet of Things as changing the way that people experience all sorts of services, and it will enable greater workplace accessibility. That's something we're particularly excited about in relation to blind and partially sighted people and employment, because there is a very significant problem that 1 in 4 people who are visually impaired who are of working age are currently in work. That's an absolute scandal, and we want to work with employers and digital platform providers to make sure that that statistic changes in the future, because it's been incredibly stubborn. And we're sure that the only way to move forward on that is through genuine collaboration and change. Next slide, please. So we can see that inclusion is about a whole range of factors, and it's about thinking about the attitude, skills, and knowledge of our teams, but thinking much more broadly about the culture, thinking about where we want to be. How do we know when we're getting there? How do we know when we're getting closer? How can we utilize the experience of blind and partially sighted people and others with disabilities to really make sure that our product pipeline and our development is as inclusive as it can be? So thank you very much for listening. I'd love to chat to people. If you'd like to find out more, you can contact RNIB, rnib.org.uk. You can find me at Robin Spinks on Twitter, or you can get in touch with the RNIB helpline and you can find out more about our services and products and how we can help you. Thank you very much for listening.